Here I am, John Atack, yet again, and I have Alec Nevala-Lee as my guest. And I'm quite excited about this because we were in touch 5 or 6 years ago, and you were writing a book called Astounding about the Astounding science fiction magazine, which John Campbell Jr. edited and which propelled L. Ron Hubbard to a greater degree of fame and introduced Dianetics to the world way back in 1950. So you've written a remarkable book and an important book because I think it is a seminal period in science fiction and therefore a seminal period in literature. We can't push science fiction aside and pretend it's something other than literature. Hubbard was, of course, a maverick in his own terms and a fairly wild character. You say of him, and I loved this. This was in an article you wrote called Xenu's Paradox, which I'm sure many of our viewers will recognize as a reference to Hubbard's operating Thetan Level 3 course. And you said, from his gargantuan body of work, you can extract a thin slice that is still worth reading. And having read a great deal of Hubbard's fiction myself, I couldn't agree more. So what interested you in the project? How did you come to it?
Well, first off, thanks, for inviting me here. Your book, A Piece of Blue Sky, was a fantastic resource for Astounding. As I was saying earlier, it saved me a lot of time because Hubbard, there's a lot of misinformation out there, and it was good to have a book that I could trust, that I thought was a reliable source for some of the information that I wasn't able to research firsthand. Because Hubbard, he's someone that I found interesting for a long time, but he kind of became part of this book almost by accident. My original plan had been to write a history of the magazine Astounding Science Fiction, later known as Analog, which I'd written for a long time. I was a big fan of, that period and interested in, the history of the genre. But within like a day or two of trying to attack this project, I realized that there was a better book that I could write, which was a biography of John W. Campbell, the editor of Astounding and Analog during this period, who is, as you know, an incredibly interesting figure, complex and controversial and, misunderstood in some ways. And I was like, this is a fantastic subject for a biography. And so it kind of, almost overnight, it became a Campbell biography. And the short version of what happened then is that my publisher, my editor, said Campbell is, clearly an intriguing figure, but he is not well known enough to justify this kind of book for a mainstream readership. Can you expand the story slightly to incorporate other writers from that period? And I said, well, the obvious three are Isaac Asimov, Robert A. Heinlein, and L. Ron Hubbard. And she said, that sounds great. And so it was sort of, I arrived at Hubbard almost inadvertently because he's a huge part of the Campbell story. Campbell's career cannot be understood. And by extension, the evolution of science fiction during this period can't be understood without looking at how Hubbard influenced it. Not so much as a writer, but through Dianetics and sort of his personality and his presence during these, like in these circles during this period. So Hubbard is a big part of the story. And yeah, sometimes people ask me, why is Hubbard, in the title of your book, was he really that great a writer? And, I say a few things. Number one is that even if he wasn't a good writer or an important writer, he is such an important part of that story. I couldn't neglect him. It would be frankly foolish to not talk about Hubbard, given the interest in his career that people still have, right? To write about this period and not make Hubbard a central figure, simply from like a commercial point of view, it was kind of a no-brainer, right? Because people are obviously interested in his story. And finally, and maybe we can talk about this a little bit more, the narrative that he was a minor writer, that he was not an important figure during this period, is kind of one that has been imposed on the history of science fiction after the fact because of Scientology. People are uncomfortable with the idea that Hubbard, the founder of Scientology, could have been an important figure in the actual literary genre of science fiction. And so you can see that history has been revised a bit to remove him from the narrative. But if you go back and read the original stories and the magazines and the letters and the memoirs, you see that he was incredibly influential, shall we say, or at least he was a presence, that you could not ignore in that community. So part of the point of the book is to go back and kind of, recenter the story a little bit, saying, even if we didn't, regardless of my personal feelings about Hubbard's, afterlife, he's clearly a major figure, right? For better or for worse, during this time period. And I wanted to write a book that would reflect that.
Yeah, and it isn't to say that he was a great writer.
Right.
With Heinlein and with Asimov, we reached that conclusion, I think.
Right.
It's that he was there and he definitely had an influence, and that shouldn't be written out of history. That, of course, he stopped writing fiction in 1949 and found something that made him a lot more money, and didn't come back to it until 1980 with Battlefield Earth. I
Right.
was in touch with A. Van Vogt, who's another incredible character at this time. And I as a kid, I read Van Vogt's stories and I thought they were wonderful. And so I was quite surprised. I hadn't known until after I'd left Scientology that Van Vogt had been a close friend of Hubbard's and had in fact abandoned writing fiction in 1950 so that he could concentrate on giving Dianetic auditing or processing to people. He never followed Scientology. He didn't believe in the spirit or any of that kind of stuff. I was in touch with him in 1984 because he'd written a puff for Battlefield Earth by Hubbard about what a great book it was. And so I wrote to him and said, why did you say that? Because it evidently isn't a great book. And he said, oh, we're old friends. I didn't read it.
Yes, yes, that's funny. Yeah, Van Vogt is someone I really admire. He's someone who I also am a big fan of his work. And you're right, this is actually a good example of how it's hard to untangle the literary history of science fiction from Dianetics, because Van Vogt is not as famous as Asimov or Heinlein, but I think I would say they're equal in many ways as a writer. And I think one reason why he is not better known is that, during the 50s, when science fiction was becoming more of a mainstream category, Asimov and Heinlein were in a position to take advantage of that shift, right? Whereas Van Vogt was busy with Dianetics and other things that kind of kept him out of the field for a while during this pivotal moment when he could have really broken through. And I think that's a big reason why he is not as well known today as a lot of other writers from that time.
Yes, I think so. And of course, the same, as we've said, happens to Hubbard, that he withdraws from the field. But he's there to give kind of human interest, to give stories that Campbell wants him. He doesn't know anything about gizmos, gadgets, and machines. And of course, although he would claim to be a nuclear physicist, he'd actually, as you point out in your book, failed, of course, in atomic and molecular physics. I eventually found a lecture where he says that. In September 1950, a lecture called Introduction to Dianetics, where he says, I got an F grade. Despite the pretensions later to a tremendous scientific career. But he's a fabulist. He's a person who is living in the stories and telling the stories and very rarely tells the truth about anything. And yet is part of this fantastic, this fabulous life that is generated around these fairly bohemian characters at this time. And it's a time where they are considered, they're producing penny dreadfuls, they're producing, penny a word, pulp fiction. So they're not being regarded. And as you said at the beginning of the conversation, Asimov and Heinlein are important writers, along with people like say, Malcolm Bradbury or Arthur C. Clarke, who came up through the genre. And in the same way that if we look back to the 19th century to Dickens was not regarded at all by the critics. He was a popular writer. And anybody who's read Great Expectations understands that this man really did know what he was doing. There is nothing like Great Expectations in Ron Hubbard's oeuvre. I think Stephen King said that Fear was the best story he'd ever read. Which is quite surprising. But I speak as somebody who's never managed to finish a Stephen King novel. So
well, I'm a big King fan, actually,
no.
And that's interesting. That's an interesting observation. Bradbury was also a big fan of Fear, the novel Fear. And one thing that is worth mentioning is that I'm not, I can't say I'm a Hubbard fan. That there are some books of his that I've read that I liked. And again, it's a small percentage of his output. But writers I admire were influenced by him. Writers who we've just mentioned, like Heinlein. Heinlein had incredible regard for Hubbard's skills as a writer. Asimov was a huge fan before he was even a writer himself. Growing up as a teenager in Brooklyn, he read Astounding, obviously, and he read Unknown, the fantasy magazine that Campbell published, where Hubbard wrote tons of stories, and he was Asimov was a huge Hubbard fan. So you have to kind of remember that at the time, Hubbard was kind of this character. He was this like larger than life figure who was known in New York pulp circles as being the kind of like I said, like fabulous. Like he told tall tales and he was memorable, in the room, right? But he also wrote stories that, again, maybe like by our standards, haven't really held up as well. But at the time, people whose taste I think one can respect thought he was good. He was considered to be one of the top, I would say, 5 or 6 writers in the field for a long time.
And it, looking back, I mean, I enjoyed some of those early stories. And I think the failure is he was a first draft author. I think the only other successful writer I know of is Rider Haggard, who couldn't bear to reread his own work. And first draft authors need incredible editors, and he didn't have one.
Right.
And so the stories can be satisfying, but his style, his way of, saying Slaves of Sleep, where he's trying to imitate piratic language. And of course, he was far more interested in piracy, both as a career personally and the history of pirates, than he was in science fiction. He was never really interested in science fiction.
Yes.
So he's bringing tales of daring do, and he was writing as Legionnaire 149, 148, or was it 149? I'm forgetting his number, about the French Foreign Legion. And there's a kind of gusto, that there's an energy to his work, and the stories are imaginative. They do tend to fall into we got to the back of the wardrobe and we entered Narnia. His devices to move into other worlds are fairly simple, but nonetheless the stories themselves are not bad. But his literary style is truly awful in places. His belief that he's writing 17th century English, or it's just terribly misplaced.
Right. And again, like, this is true of a lot of pulp writers of that period. They were not writing for posterity. They did not think that these stories would be read, beyond their initial publication. And, I mean, this is true of Asimov, let's say, those early stories are very clunky. Heinlein was the exception. I think he was probably the best writer. And he was, he did 2 drafts, let's say. He did not, there was no incentive to laboriously revise any of these stories, given the fact you were trying to earn a living by writing, for a penny a word. But, Heinlein was probably the most interesting stylist, I would say, of that time. But, Hubbard was, I mean, I read a lot of pulp fiction from that period. I would say Hubbard was above average. There's a reason why he had a following, especially for stuff like adventure fiction. I mean, you mentioned like his love of piracy, of the sea, which really comes through. I read all of his science fiction from that period. I've read all the fantasy. I have not read all the other stuff, right? Because he wrote westerns, he wrote, adventure stories. I've kind of sampled it. But one thing I've noticed is that, the closer the story is to the sea, the more interesting it is, because it engages him on some deeper level, right? He really loves thinking about, the Navy and about pirates. And he does not, as you point out, love science. The science fiction stories from this period are really perfunctory, okay? And very few of them are worth reading now. Whereas, like, even some of the fantasy stuff that he wrote during this period, I think is pretty good. I think his personality was much more suited to fantasy fiction, let's say, than science fiction, which is like kind of interesting and ironic, given the way his career progressed.
Yes, and that he would create. It's funny, the word Scientology, which he adopted, was first used by a linguist called Alan Upward in 1910. And he used the word to mean pseudoscience.
Interesting.
And so we have this. Then later we have a guy called Nortonholtz, who's an Aryan race theorist for the Nazi Party, writing a book called Scientology in 1934. So he's grabbed hold of this world, and there is this sense, and it's profound in the first couple of years when Dianetics is released and when Scientology comes out of it, that he wants it to sound science-y. And I've interviewed a guy called, or corresponded with a guy called Perry Chapdelaine, who was with Hubbard in 1950, and it was a mathematician. And he said one evening he got a phone call from Hubbard saying, "Bring a bottle of scotch. We need to write something that sounds scientific." And they wrote the Dianetic axioms, which I may be the only person in the world who's read them. They're not on any Scientology course, and they're, lambda, theta. That it's written as if we're now studying algebra.
Wow.
And it's a brave attempt, but abject nonsense when it comes down to it.
Yeah. No, I mean that's actually a very interesting point, right? The idea that he wants to sound scientific. Because again, he is tailoring these ideas toward a certain audience. Okay. And one thing I enjoy talking about, in the book is that Campbell is really involved in shaping, the presentation of this material, like in the late 40s, right?
Yeah.
So Hubbard and Campbell, to me, one of the big revelations of my research, the thing that struck me the most is that they were collaborators. They were equal partners, at that stage. And the underlying ideas were Hubbard's, but Campbell had a big impact on the vocabulary and how this stuff was written up. Because he wanted to attract an audience of scientists, of medical professionals, and of science fiction fans. Okay. And Campbell understood that to interest people like this, you have to kind of couch it in terms that sound scientific. So stuff like cybernetics becomes a big influence on this period in Dianetics. Even though Hubbard himself, is not really interested in cybernetics. He is not someone who has read this stuff. He's not familiar with like the work the way that Campbell is. So the first, articles about Dianetics have this kind of veneer of cybernetic language that Campbell imposes. And then later, the two of them have this famous falling out. They go their separate ways, and all that stuff kind of gets dropped. Like the language that Campbell introduces in the earliest articles, and even in the book Dianetics, it's de-emphasized, right? Because it's not the language that Hubbard speaks naturally, right? It's the language that Campbell speaks naturally. But Hubbard draws from other sources. I would say he's more interested in like mystical sources and the occult. And you can see that change, right? And there's this interesting period before kind of Scientology proper takes shape, when he's dropped the Campbellian material and is still kind of developing what it's going to become with his followers, who again are mostly science fiction fans, so that their influence is very clear in what comes out of that too.
Yes, very much so. And of course there is this break that the New Jersey Medical Association sue Hubbard and Dianetics for practicing medicine without a license. All 5 of the original foundations, in pretty much within a year, are bankrupt. All of the directors of them saying Hubbard came and took the money. So Hubbard's facing suit. His marriage, his second and bigamous marriage to Sarah Northrop, is falling apart. He kidnaps their baby child, and Alexis Valerie takes her to Cuba with Richard DeMille in tow, who's Cecil B. DeMille's son. I mean, it just keeps on growing, this story.
Yeah.
And while he's there, a Wichita oil man, Don Purcell, says, "I'll bail you out." And he buys Dianetics from Hubbard for $1 because they really think everything is going to go wrong. And so Hubbard has not only given up the name Dianetics, he's also given up the book, Dianetics, the Modern Science of Health, which has been pulled out of publication because Art Cephos, John Campbell's friend who published it, has said it's fraudulent. It does not work. The claims being made here are simply untrue. And he commissions Hubbard's partner, Dr. Joe Winter, to write Doctor's Report on Dianetics, which castigates Hubbard, but still reckons that Dianetics is a good idea. What happens in the midst of that is that Hubbard finds himself without Dianetics, fighting with Don Purcell, who's funded his return, and desperate to do something new because he has no following anymore. And he creates Scientology. And where Campbell has been the inspiration for the language of Dianetics and some of the ideas of Dianetics, now it'll be Aleister Crowley. Bull pelt, it'll be. It'll be the occult. And it's then translating the occult into scientific sounding terms. So where we would have the magical will or thelema of Aleister Crowley, we have intention or tone 40 in Scientology. And you've translated this or postulates where rather than this being a philosophic premise, it becomes a wish. And in Scientology, you have this idea where you have these postulates, and just like The Secret or Christian Science, everything is a consequence of your thinking. Everything that happens to you is a consequence of your thinking. And Hubbard goes off and creates his own navy in the midst of all this, speaking of being a pirate.
Yeah, I mean, this period to me is really interesting because, you know, one thing I talk about in the book is it's around this time that past lives start to become a factor. You know, like Dianetics auditing has always gone back to the prenatal state, right? To like before you were born, you hear these things in the womb that kind of affect your personality. And I think it's kind of natural that you would keep going, you know, and you would say, okay, well, what about previous lives? How did those affect you? And so people are basically under hypnosis, you know, with Hubbard, and they're recalling these past lives. And a lot of them are science fiction themed, right? Because if you're encouraging someone to let's just say fantasize and kind of come up with this scenario about their past life, and they are a science fiction fan, it's often going to have those elements. It's going to have those images. And I think what you're seeing in this period is like Hubbard and his followers in this kind of feedback loop where they're giving him this material, he is embellishing it, feeding it back to them. And that's where a lot of the sort of the space opera elements in Scientology come from. It's from Hubbard responding to the stuff that his followers are kind of spontaneously generating in these sessions.
That's certainly the impression that Hubbard wished to generate. In June 1951, when Science of Survival, his second book, was published, there is this kind of disquisition about, you know, of course, people are finding these past lives, and I'm not sure about this, because he's still hedging his bets. He doesn't know, you know, he knows that if he overstates something, he could be in trouble. But what we do know, of course, is that he believed in past lives long before Dianetics, because he was a follower of Aleister Crowley.
Yeah.
And so he is less than truthful. He is economical with the truth. It's like the idea that he didn't come up with the notion of it being a religion. And he would always say, you know, in February 1954, Burton Farber registered the first Church of Scientology, Church of Scientology of California, end of. And you go, well, what about the 3 registrations for churches in Camden, New Jersey in December 53, which all have his signature, his young wife, Mary Sue's on, his third wife, and the signature of his oldest son, L. Ron Hubbard Jr. This is the Church of Scientology, the Church of Human Engineering, and the Church of American Science, which has as its purpose to recruit Christians and move them on, and I quote, to something better, like Scientology. So, and he's written on 10th of April 1953, he's written a letter to his immediate junior, Helen O'Brien, and said, what do you think of the religion angle? So I think that he always knew that he was going to go down this direction of past lives. But as you say, the feedback comes from the following that are largely science fiction fans. So yes, you've got, I'm told by Karen de la Carrière, who was supervised everything in Clearwater, Florida for them, that she knew of 200 people who thought they'd been Jesus Christ in a past life. Wow. And so, and significant Napoleons, Caesars, what have you. But you are so right. Normally it's robot doll bodies racing in atomic powered cars, which is the kind of story that Hubbard himself told. We find out about the 4th invader force who live on Venus, and the 5th, and it's a bit hot there, and the 5th invader force who live on Mars, and it's a bit cold there. And anybody who thinks their hands are too big used to be a member of the 5th invader force. And we have these tiny little islands in the 1.25 quadrillion years that Hubbard posits we've been around, which is a very long time indeed. We have these tiny little moments that we are given a vision of, which are all rather like 1940s science fiction when you look at it. And, you know, of course, the past life thing, you know, there's been absolutely no evidence suggested that, and it would be easy if somebody had had a past life in, you know, medieval France, they'd be able to speak medieval French, and that's very easy to check. And nobody has. And although Hubbard insisted that all of his followers had lived for 1.25 quadrillion years. I thought a quadrille was a dance, but apparently you can extend it to millions of millions of millions of years. And so when he had a couple of hundred people aboard his ship, there was a point where he sent a crew with a boat with no nautical experience, because of course they'd remember it from past lives. But when they couldn't get anybody in port to speak French or Spanish, nobody sort of went, well, surely there must be somebody in their past life spoke French or Spanish. So it becomes an imaginative construction with which people join. That if there is such a thing as reincarnation, it is likely that there have been other planetary civilizations before our own. Even if we restrict ourselves to 13.8 billion years, it's very possible. And so therefore, if we have these things, the problem is, of course, that you're dealing with the incredible ability to make false memories. And so, it does get rather dangerous. Did you encounter anything by George Hay when you were researching?
The name rings a bell. Can you remind me a little bit about George Hay?
Yeah,
I do. I think I did, yes. But why don't you give me some background?
Yeah, George was the man who invited Hubbard to England in 1951 for the first time, and he was a science fiction writer himself. He gave up writing following a series of projects. I had the great pleasure of knowing him towards the end of his life in the 1980s. One of his projects was to create what was then the Northeast London Polytechnic Science Fiction Library, which was the first university library in the UK of science fiction, and to regard science fiction in that way. But he was somebody, he'd been around Hubbard and watched the change in Hubbard. And because I spoke to so many people who'd known Hubbard from birth onwards. We had an interview with Margaret Roberts, which Russell Miller did, and Margaret Roberts was his aunt. She was 8 years older than him. So we were able to check things about whether he really was a blood brother of the Blackfoot Pecuni Indians. And her answer to that, having lived in the same house as him until he was 12 years old, is that there was no contact of any kind with the Blackfoot. And of course, they've said we never made any blood brothers, and there's no record of Ron Hubbard ever meeting Tom Madfeathers or Old Mayo, as he's also called in other places. He's a man who lives inside stories. So you quite rightly say in your excellent book that there will be a kernel of truth in his stories, that he himself, in one of those Dianetic axioms, says that there is no such thing as imagination. We simply further work on stories that already exist. I personally don't think that's true. I think occasionally new stories do come along, but in his case, everything is reworked. So the Blackfoot story fascinated me, and I dug and dug and dug. The nearest reservation to Helena, Montana, is 170 miles away. So as a 6-year-old boy, he probably wasn't kind of popping over to hang out with his blood brothers. I think that what's more likely is that there was some kind of family story, because when he went by train at 6 months old to Helena, Montana, from Kalispell, that train actually went through. It stopped at a Blackfoot reservation. It's the only immediate contact I could find. And it was 1911, and there will have been members of the tribe begging on the station, probably for alcohol at that point, because it's a really low point in a remarkable people's history. And there was probably some comment in the factory, in the family, about that. So his 2 little holidays in China became studying with gurus in the East. And as you know, you're one of the few people who've seen his diaries, that they've still not become public. But when he was 16 and went to China, he kept a diary. I think he's 15 and 16, but there are 3 diaries, and there are 2 handwritten ones, and there's one typed up. And the typed up one is much better than the original it comes from. And it shows that writer's tendency to elaborate and embroider upon their experience and turn it into something. Somerset Maugham in his writer's handbook actually offers you his notes to say, wherever I am, I scribble these things down. I think these things. And of course, in his life, the Ashendon stories they're the first 20th century spy stories because he was a spy, Somerset Maugham, working for British intelligence. And in the same way, Hubbard has an experience and magnifies it. And it becomes, ultimately it becomes Scientology, which is kind of like a fabulous science fiction story all of its own.
Yeah, I mean, to me, this is the most interesting part of what we're talking about. The idea that, yes, these ideas grow from these kernels, these seeds that are planted early on, right? But if you think about like what actually appeals to Hubbard himself, what are the stories that resonate with him personally? They tend to be westerns, like this fantasy about being like a blood brother. They tend to be nautical stories. Aviation, is something that he thinks about a lot. But not, and and there's this sort of interesting like layer of like Arabian Nights, Richard Francis Burton, sort of like this Orientalist, kind of stuff that comes out of a lot of these fantasy stories. So this is what he writes when he's like, writing for his own, I wouldn't say his own pleasure because he's writing to sell, but his own interests kind of run more in that direction. And science fiction, as we talked about, he's really writing that for the money, right? He is not a science fiction fan. He's not a science fan. He's writing because Campbell is a great market, and he can sell these stories, and he builds an audience that way. But to me, it's always interesting that when he's given the chance to live out fantasies in his own life, they tend to look more like nautical fiction. The idea of the Sea Org, him in this uniform, like that is what he's talking back to, right? Like if he's going to live out this fantasy, it's going to look more like that, right? And so the science fiction elements in Scientology, to me, I've always thought seem to come from elsewhere, right? They are kind of coming out of, as we said earlier, like the milieu of fans that he has access to, and kind of takes over his life in ways that I think even he, was kind of surprised by. Like if it had been up to him, it's unclear that, the science fiction would have been as prominent an element in Scientology as it later became. Right. I think this is him reacting in some ways to his available audience. And if he were just like left to his own devices, I think, you'd end up with something that was a lot more mystical, a lot more indebted to fantasy and to the occult, as we said before, right? And the science fiction stuff, it seems almost like, pragmatically speaking, given the people that he was surrounded by, he knew that this is what they wanted to hear. And kind of ends up absorbed in these ideas, and even in like his life in ways that I think even he was kind of surprised by.
Yeah, I think he was carried along by that, and there are so many strange elements to his story. For example, his relationship with Leni Riefenstahl, which is a shock that Leni Riefenstahl, having made Triumph of the Will and Olympia for Hitler, would never work again. And given the quality of those two documentaries, that's a terrible shame. Given the quality of the human being, maybe it isn't. But she was Ron Hubbard's guest in London. She stayed in his apartment there. And so he's cultivating, people who are not necessarily in the mainstream. And I think he's very much influenced. You probably know something about Arthur J. Burks, and you probably know a lot more about him than I do.
Yes.
And I think he was an incredible influence on Hubbard.
Yeah, for people that don't know Burks, so he was a pulp fiction writer from that period, and he was kind of like Hubbard's mentor a little bit in the pulp world.
This is the book Monitors that you have there.
Yeah, so I'm one of the few owners of this book.
I have a copy too. We are the two people in the world who have it.
That's great. Yeah, no, I actually was looking at this recently, and so Burks was sort of an established pulp writer before Hubbard arrived in New York, and kind of like embodied what Hubbard wanted to be as a writer in that period. This guy who could just crank out stories, incredibly like fast writer, who had lots of ideas. Maybe not the greatest stylist, but certainly a very prolific, competent pulp writer. And he's one of the, I mean, there's a really famous story about how Campbell was ordered to buy whatever Burks and Hubbard wrote because they were reliable writers with an audience, at a time when Astounding needed people like this, in its roster of authors. And Burks also was a occultist. He did these. I mean, I'm not a Burks expert, but I know that he engaged in automatic writing and in these sort of spirit seance type activities with a spirit guide whose identity is a little bit hard to pin down. And Hubbard was part of that group. He was familiar with Burks's occult interests, in the late 30s. He pops up occasionally in monitors under a different name.
It's called the Redhead. Yeah.
And so you're right. I mean, Burks is an interesting figure here who I would love to dig into a little bit more someday, because it's obvious that a lot of the stuff here that they were doing in the 30s like pays off much later on in Hubbard's career.
Yeah, there's a period at the beginning of 1949. Hubbard is visiting Burks in Savannah, and Burks, of course, is a major in the Marines. He's a successful military officer. And there is a letter written by Hubbard to Forry Ackerman, his agent, in January 49, where he says he has discovered a method where you can rape women and they won't know about it. And he thinks there is an incredible amount of money possible in this method. This is the first mention of the first version of Dianetics, which is nothing like the version that's released. But it's fascinating that he's not saying anything about benefiting people with this technique. He's talking about raping women without their consent or knowledge and making a lot of money. And he's right there with Burks. So when you look at the book monitors, he describes that visit. That's what he's talking about. And there is there are several passages in there which, if you know what surrounds them, are really quite fascinating. So, for example, Burke says that Hubbard was an accomplished glider pilot, and he'd called himself a barnstorming pilot with the nickname Flash Hubbard. And he is never frightened when he's flying because he can see his holy guardian angel on the wing. Now, this is a Crowleyite notion, the holy guardian angel, and he describes her. He says she has red hair and a green dress. In writings that Scientology has tried to keep secret but went into a court case, we find that this character is the Empress. And she is his holy guardian angel in the Crowleyite system. He believes that she is always with him. She is always protecting him. And there is a peculiar little passage in, I think it's in Dianetics, The Evolution of Science. It's either there or in Dianetics, the original thesis, both of which were in fact constructed after the time they're meant to belong to, where he talks about the methods he used to devise Dianetics. One of them is automatic writing. In 1984, I talked with a woman called Jo Scott, who'd been Hubbard's secretary in 1954 in London at Fitzgerald Square. And he said to me one day that Dianetics, the modern science of mental health, was automatic writing dictated by the Empress. Do you know what he meant?
Wow.
So you find yourself cross-referencing. The other thing in there is that Burks talks about the little its, these little spiritual beings. And he says, and the redhead can see them and they jump between his fingers. This will later be recycled as the big secret of Scientology, the indwelling body thetans, the little spirits, the demons that we're all supposed to be possessed with. So I do think there's a lot more that could be found out about Burks and his relationship to Hubbard. But in reading Stranger in a Strange Land, which is why I came to you a couple of weeks ago, because I read it when I was in Scientology. I thought nothing particularly of it, than that it was an amusing book. Coming back to it, it is startling, the parallels between Hubbard's thinking and Heinlein's thinking. And it's made me think that perhaps Scientology is a project of a series of collaborations Burke's first, Campbell afterwards, and Heinlein along the way as well. And that there are
Interesting.
conversations these men are having, which Hubbard is putting into, or will put into, Scientology, because the belief system put forward in Stranger in a Strange Land is Scientology. You know, the abilities of Valentine Michael Smith are the abilities that Hubbard promised to his followers. And the kind of thou art God attitude is, you know, has a relationship to Scientology. So I'm really interested in that relationship with Heinlein, you know, knowing only what I've read in your book about Heinlein, which is quite a lot and very useful. How close were they? You know, how much time did they spend together? We hear that Hubbard protested that Heinlein had made him have sex with Heinlein's wife. And I have heard, and I am not able to confirm it because I can't afford to look at Heinlein's diaries because they're kind of $1 a page or something.
Right, right.
But a friend of mine who read them 10 years ago said there's actually a record of a homosexual relationship between Hubbard and Heinlein.
So yes, so this is why I wanted to talk to you. You know, I think this is really interesting stuff that you know, deserves to be looked at closely. So Heinlein was based in Los Angeles, all right, and you know, this is mostly during the period when Hubbard's in New York in the late 30s, and so they were not in the same room that much during this period. You know, that we're talking about early on before the war. Okay. And then during the war, they're deployed to different locations as well. They correspond. You know, Heinlein is aware of Hubbard's version of his naval service. Okay, which, as you know, is largely fabricated. And the key thing is that, you know, they reunite in Philadelphia. Okay, and this is toward the end of the war, and this is the first time they've really spent a lot of time together, although they're kind of mutual admirers. This is the time when there is an alleged encounter between Leslie Heinlein and Hubbard, which I think did happen. And the background here is that Heinlein believed Hubbard was a war hero. Okay, he was a fan of Hubbard's work before this, and he heard Hubbard's accounts of being wounded in battle and recovering from these injuries, and he accepted them at face value. Okay, he never questioned them, even years later. All right. So he thought that Hubbard was a hero who had been hurt in the war, and I think this is what you need to know to understand this friendship, because he encourages him to sleep with Leslin. It's kind of clear if there's anything else. You know, you talk about this other encounter. I have not been able to verify that. It's certainly worth mentioning. I think Leslin is the one who actually talks about this, who alludes to this having happened. So I don't know. Okay, that's the short answer.
Yeah.
But I do know that after the war, Hubbard, after he is discharged, I think he's in a psychiatric hospital or a veterans hospital. He lives with Heinlein and Leslin for a period in Los Angeles. Okay, and they are housemates. They are writing, you know, kind of like we don't call it. You know, they have like an arrangement, right, where Hubbard gets to live there. This is prior to Jack Parsons, another interesting episode who Hubbard meets through Heinlein. And so they're part of this circle. They're part of the circle of writers in Los Angeles. And then later on, there's a falling out, which I don't really know the details of, but it sounds like Hubbard is talking big about some big plan about going to China with like guns and knives. It's like one of these like sort of wild stories that he's always kind of spinning. And Leslin's nephews, I think, get involved in some way, or they get excited by the idea of like maybe going to China with Hubbard. Heinlein thinks this is crossing a line. He gets really angry. And, you know, they have like, you know, a period where Heinlein does not trust Hubbard. All right. I think he still believes in Hubbard's war record, but otherwise, and maybe, you know, kind of inexplicably, you know, he knows that Hubbard is a fabulist, that he makes up things and that he is unreliable in certain ways. And then they kind of, again, they part ways, and they don't really cross paths again in person after that point. They correspond, you know, there are still letters between the two of them. Heinlein is certainly aware of Dianetics. He is interested, mostly through Campbell writing to him, actually, kind of describing the work that he is doing with Hubbard. He is not this is a very interesting point to me. So Heinlein is in Los Angeles in the, I would say 1950, I want to say, working on a movie. And he leaves just before Dianetics takes off in Los Angeles. And I've always wondered what would have happened if Heinlein had been around in LA instead of going to Colorado. If he'd been there at the same time that people like Van Vogt were getting involved. And there's a interesting alternate history, let's say, where Heinlein would have been much more involved than he ended up being. But there's kind of almost like a quirk of timing where he is not present. He's geographically distant, from sort of the hotbed of Dianetics during that period. And so you have to talk about Stranger in a Strange Land, these similarities, which I think are real. I think a lot of what you're seeing in Stranger in a Strange Land reflects Heinlein's awareness of Scientology, in terms of this friend of his has started a cult that is getting attention and getting followers and, earning him lots of money, right? And I think Heinlein is interested in, and almost amused by this. He knows Hubbard, right? He knows Hubbard well enough to be skeptical, I would say, of any answers that Hubbard is offering. All right. But again, it's mostly affectionate. It's mostly him being kind of like tickled by his friend's unexpected second act, right? And and that stays more or less positive until the end, right? He always speaks of Hubbard as a war hero. He always looks back fondly on that friendship, apart from a few bumps along the way. So the question about influence, I think, is an interesting one. Okay, I want to very quickly give you my opinion, right?
Please, yeah.
Which is that I think any similarities between Heinlein's ideas as expressed in Stranger in a Strange Land and Scientology are less about any direct dialogue between the two of them as it is a reflection of like a common origin, right? They're both coming out of the Campbellian period in Astounding, when the idea of the Superman, the idea of psychology as an exact science, and of the sort of mental engineering that you would use to enhance your abilities and attain these powers, that's a key part of science fiction, like during that period. And Heinlein writes stories, much earlier that explore these themes. And I think that Hubbard's ideas, in some ways, are also rooted in the same kind of the source. And so and again, I could be wrong, and there are other people that know Heinlein better than I do, but my impression is that the two of them didn't talk about this stuff directly, at least not in the kind of detailed way you might expect. I think they are kind of drawing on a common, like a foundation, shall we say, of ideas that kind of they developed them separately, right? But they look similar, right? Because they come from the same place. And I think that's the answer. I'm pretty sure that's the explanation for the parallels that you're seeing.
Yeah, I mean, Hubbard's foray into mysticism is slight. He isn't somebody who sat and read the Vedas and the Mahabharata and the Pali Canon, and his references to Buddhism, to Taoism, are secondhand. They're generally what Aleister Crowley had to say.
Right.
And might it be that this common source is indeed Aleister Crowley? You say that Heinlein knew Parsons. Do you know more about that relationship? Jack Parsons, of course, being the magician, the Crowleyite magician who was at Jet Propulsion's laboratories and developed solid rocket fuel, and performed a ritual in the attempt to incarnate the Whore of Babylon, which would lead to the end days, the coming of Armageddon, and all of this sort of stuff.
So there is a thread of mystical thinking in Heinlein's work that goes back kind of early on. He was interested in theosophy, which is related field. And he looked into psychic powers, so it's possible there is like some influence there, or like some affinity there. The other guy who I should mention is Alfred Korzybski.
Yes,
he's a Polish philosopher who is absolutely a sort of common reference point here. Okay?
Yes.
So Krzyzewski founded this field called general semantics, which, and again, I'm not that familiar with it, but it is a kind of mental engineering. It's this idea that you can kind of like train the mind to, see things more accurately, to avoid these illusions that we all have. Heinlein was a big fan of Krzyzewski. He knew his work really well. Okay. Hubbard refers to him a few times. It's unclear to me whether he actually got through those books. They are fairly dense.
He didn't.
Okay.
Sarah, the second wife, and A. van Vogt explained general semantics to Hubbard.
That's exactly what I gathered. And again, this is a interesting point because Krzyzewski's ideas were kind of trendy in science fiction for a period. Like I would say, starting in the 40s, Van Vogt writes several really interesting stories that seem to like World of Null A that are clearly influenced by Krzyzewski. Heinlein has several stories from this period that are clearly influenced by Krzyzewski. So, it's kind of in the air, right? And I think Hubbard absorbs this in the way that, as you point out, he absorbs other stuff, even without being familiar with them firsthand. He's kind of the sponge that soaks up, stray bits of information and language and ideas that he can kind of then assimilate and turn into, his own stuff, right? And I think that's true of Krzyzewski. I think if you want to see like a, like where these two guys overlap, that's kind of a good place to start, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, Krzyzewski is actually, Hubbard references him in a book as a source before he decides that all of the ideas in Scientology are his own entirely. Right. And a couple of the ideas, that the one is that the word is not the thing itself, which is a very important thing to realize in this world, I think. And the other famous Krzyzewski statement, the map is not the territory. And that perhaps relates to, I'm told Immanuel Kant first put forward the idea that there is the world around us and there is the world that we inhabit as individuals, how we interpret the world and we perceive the world through that lens. Hubbard would make this, you have your own universe, and which is not in fact correct use of the word universe, but we won't get into that, which is an entire system of created things. We did get into it. Sorry about that. So we have these ideas that come from Krzyzewski, but the sense I have after so many years is that Hubbard was not deep. But there isn't, he'll refer to the Encyclopedia Britannica, the pre-First World War edition, the Fall of the Roman Empire by Gibbons, the abridged version of Fraser's Golden Bough, because who's going to read more than 900 pages about that? And he just keeps circling round these sets of things. A friend of mine went to visit Hubbard's former home at St. Hill Mansion near East Grinstead in Sussex, and they still in his office had the books on the shelves. And my friend started writing the titles down, and he thought, well, I can come back and do this again some other time. And when he went back, the shelves were empty. Wow. Because the books on them were science fiction, pulps, popular manuals on hypnosis, and books about magic. And, it wasn't sort of, the profound work of great psychologists or anything of that nature. It was largely pulp. And he pulled all of these things together and somehow made them sound, and I'm embarrassed, I was involved with Scientology, I have to admit it, so if anybody wants to humiliate me, that's all they have to say. He used to be involved in Scientology. He wrote a book about it, but those ideas somehow are convincing to, I was only 19 when I got involved, and that's the only excuse I have. But there have also been, there were 8 medical doctors in Scientology and 3 dentists that I knew in the UK. There was a professor of sociology. There were 2 NASA scientists I knew. And of course, a lot of very celebrated actors and musicians. So it kind of shows that you can pass all this stuff up and you can sell it on. And you can sell it on without it actually achieving anything. So you can make claims about, you'll have telepathic skills. Nobody's got them, and there's no demonstration of them. But if you just give us another $10,000, who knows what might happen? It interested me that Heinlein also remained fascinated by psychic powers and keeps coming back to the idea of telepathy and a telepathy machine and this sort of thing. And so I think there's something in the sort of foundation of credulity that these are men who are willing to believe things of this nature. And even though Heinlein was an engineer, he really was a scientist, he was still drawn to this sort of perception of the world. Theosophy, as you say, it's a very bad starting point for anybody. I mean, out of it, we get Aryan race theory. Exactly what the Nazis came to believe was what Madame Blavatsky had said in the 1880s. She was the first person to be investigated by the British Society for Psychical Research, co-founded by William James and Mark Twain, and declared a fraud by this society who desperately wanted proof of something. She's writing down automatic writing from Tibetan masters, even gives names to them, and creates this incredibly influential body of work, which will sort of dazzle people. It has no authenticity. She really didn't study with Tibetan masters, and it produces that, out of it we get anthroposophy, with the Church Universal and Triumphant. The fascist silver shirt movement in America comes out of theosophy. And there is that last point, I think, is significant with Heinlein and with Hubbard. They're both seeking the Superman, just as Himmler did through the Lebensborn, this idea that pure Aryans would be born who would have what he called electron powers. These are the superpowers of the operating Thetan or of Valentine Michael Smith. And it seems to me, from the little I understand about Heinlein, that he was not a philosophical mind. He was not somebody who had studied theological implications. He was not practiced in hermeneutics. He was an engineer who liked the idea of magic, who liked the idea that there was a magical force of some kind in the world, and who had broken away from and wanted to break away from conventional society and the establishment.
Yes, I think you're touching on a very important point here. Okay, so the idea of the Superman predates all these people, right? Like the stories about Superman were a sort of almost a cliche in science fiction by the time Campbell came around, and Campbell really wanted to kind of reframe the Superman story. We're going to get a new kind of Superman story written that is more like you said, more scientific. At least kind of, it gives the appearance of being more scientific, and it comes out of the idea of like mental engineering, that this is something that we can all use to unlock our latent powers. And Heinlein, I mean, there's a range of responses. Okay, someone like Asimov has zero interest in the occult. He's a very rational kind of person who resists this kind of thing. Campbell and Heinlein are open to it, partly because, I mean, you never know, right? It's like Campbell is working with J.B. Ryan at Duke University, who does these famous experiments with ESP. And, Heinlein is experimenting with telepathy with his friends, like when he's a younger man. And, and it's like, what if this thing exists? What if, there are these powers? We owe it to ourselves to explore them and to see if they can be observed and quantified. And, Heinlein doesn't really pursue that seriously after a certain point. But obviously Hubbard does, and Campbell does in his own way. Campbell is looking for psychic powers until his death, essentially, looking for proof that these things exist, because it's like the next great discovery. It is the discovery that will be greater than the bomb, that will save mankind from the bomb. And that he spends 30 years doing this or longer, and it kind of comes out of this interesting mix of ideas that were already in science fiction, that Campbell takes and develops, and which Hubbard and Heinlein and Campbell all kind of develop along their own lines. I mean, that's kind of like, a part of the story that gets very hard to track because there are so many different, developments going on at the same time. But, they're all kind of grappling with the same problems. Hubbard in this like very kind of mercenary way where it becomes a means, as you point out, toward controlling people and personal wealth. But also, Campbell is doing this in New Jersey, the entire time, building these machines that can, do these unexplained things and working on, psychic experiments with his wife, Peg, who he met through, the Dianetics movement. He took it very seriously. And I think he was troubled by what Hubbard had done. He thought Scientology was garbage. Those were his words. But not just because it was, sort of this cult that had taken on all this like other stuff, but he saw it as a perversion of the goals that they had set out with. Right? They wanted to like achieve something together in the late 40s, early 50s that Campbell kept doing on his own. This Campbellian Dianetics that he was trying to develop with Peg, he never really stopped. And I think he was like a little bit, he was chagrined, kind of to see what Hubbard did with it with much greater success. If you measure it by influence and fame and money and all those things, Hubbard, kind of became all the things that he wanted to be, whereas Campbell was kind of left feeling very isolated toward the end, even though he was trying to accomplish similar things.
But they're such different men. I think Campbell was authentic. He was genuine. He really believed in this. And so seeing the way that Hubbard developed, that talking to people who were with Hubbard in the 50s, he seemed to become worse as every year went by. Then paranoia is inflicted upon him. You've got this, really the Dianetic movement collapsed by the end of 1950. It sold 150,000 copies of Modern Science and Mental Health. And then Art Ceppos pulls the book. By 1952, December 52, Hubbard gives a series of lectures which he calls the Philadelphia Doctorate Course. And isn't that great? You just sit for 6 weeks listening to somebody and you've got a doctorate, very easy way to go, which will be awarded by a diploma mill, Sequoia University, which has actually secretly been bought by Hubbard. Not something that came out until a few years ago. But there are only 38 people on that course. So by the end of, he'd had 6,000 people in the Shrine Auditorium to fail to demonstrate the properties of the clear. Poor woman couldn't even remember the color of his tie when his back was turned, let alone total recall. So his following diminished and he languished for many years. And then in 1963, Kevin Victor Anderson in Victoria, Australia, sets up an inquiry. And the media start going wild all around the world about how dreadful and sinister and dangerous Scientology is. And from having about 500 followers, by the publication of the last report, which is the UK report in 71, John Foster's report, Scientology's got about 25,000 people in it. So it's grown. And to escape from these inquiries, he's taken to international waters. He's out there at sea, paranoid and terrified, has elected himself the commodore of this little flotilla of rust buckets, fundamentally. They're not sleek marine vessels. And he accumulates hundreds of largely young people with no nautical experience, most of them, and he starts exacting horrible punishments upon them. So when they're in Corfu Harbour in 1968, if you are late for an L. Ron Hubbard lecture by a minute, you will be thrown overboard from anywhere from 25 to 40 feet high. Our high diving board in this country is 14 feet. Your ankles tied together, blindfolded, and you'll be thrown into Corfu Harbour, which of course is full of the human sewage from the other ships. I mean, things have taken a terrible turn. And Ron Hubbard has now become this powerful, sadistic, manipulative, malignant narcissist, and is now headed off in this other direction, that he's no longer writing the stories, he's become the story. he's become the protagonist, and his sanity, I think, becomes ever more questionable after that. I think there are simple facts about Ron Hubbard. One of them is he smoked 100 cigarettes a day, and it's sort of right. I am not going to follow somebody who's going to teach me about willpower who smokes 100 cigarettes a day. There are fairly oxymoronic situations that arise here, until eventually, of course, he goes completely into hiding because there are 300 writs out for him in the US. He's got to be in the US because of the heart attacks he's had, and he needs to be near to medical help. So he can't be on a boat, in the Mediterranean, or in a port in Morocco or something, though they've been thrown out of most of the ports in the Mediterranean by this time. He needs to be in the US, but he has to be in hiding. And it would seem that he then fell into dementia. And from 1983 onwards, the orders that he's sending out become, it becomes more and more vicious. The people are boasting about being ruthless, and there's a lot of shouting and screaming going on. And what had been this way of clearing the planet and ending war, insanity, and crime becomes this monster, which, of course, is still with us today as the kind of echo of Ron Hubbard and this, pirate turned magician.
Yeah. No, I mean, this is something that I want to kind of maybe close on, kind of went down a little bit. But I think that's a very interesting point. The idea that Hubbard in the end kind of becomes the worst version of himself because he is living in this echo chamber, right? He is in a position of ultimate power in this closed world, and his ideas and his impulses are kind of fed back to him by his followers. And it's I mean, almost anyone in that situation would become a psychopath or a sociopath, or it would bring out those tendencies,
exaggerate them, yes,
would be checked, in most situations. Here they're unchecked. I think that explains a lot about what Scientology became. I think Hubbard's late paranoia was then institutionalized. He kind of became this paranoid figure, and then established all these structures that have lived on after him, right? That have persisted under other people, under subsequent leadership. And what I want to kind of underline is that Campbell, never became a cult leader, never had that level of power or wealth, but I mean, his career is also kind of a tragedy. And I think he also entered kind of an echo chamber toward the end where he was not getting the kind of feedback he needed. And his views became more extreme. They became more racist, for one thing, more extreme in terms of, these incredibly strange ideas he was promoting in the magazine, and his difficulty, relating to writers that he had been friends with. Like he estranged, himself from a lot of people who loved him and from a lot of fans. And so, on a more modest scale, right? But I think there are actually like similar tendencies there. Okay.
Yeah.
Like my favorite quote actually about all this stuff, it comes from Asimov. He says that, like circa 1950, he heard that, Hubbard and Campbell had parted ways. And he says, he wasn't surprised because, he says, I knew Campbell and I knew Hubbard, and I knew that no religion can have two messiahs. And I think that kind of sums up, the difficulty that these two people, who in some ways actually were very similar, would have had, working together for much longer.
Yeah, it's a fascinating idea. So thank you very much. And everybody who's watched this, I hope, is going to rush out and buy at least 10 copies of your book and give them as gifts to everybody you know. And maybe we'll circle back round in a couple of months or something, because that might give me time to read your book about Buckminster Fuller, which I'm fascinated by.
Fuller is interesting. I'm not saying that he was, in the same category as Hubbard, but they do have interesting affinities. Similar types. For whatever reason, I'm drawn to a certain kind of personality, and I think Fuller is a different sort of incarnation of that type.
Fascinating. Thank you very much, Alec.
All right, thanks so much.
Yeah.
Hi, John here. Thanks for watching. We'd appreciate it very much if you would click like, as well as subscribe and click the bell for notifications. Every dollar helps, and we welcome new patrons on Patreon, or you can make a one-off payment with any currency through PayPal. Thanks so much.